Folks, we're still on the subject of being generosity, and we're running with this theme right up, obviously, until the 19th, when we talk about the ultimate act of generosity that came from heaven. And I may have finished a little bit early as we moved into Advent, but the reason, obviously, is I just felt so burdened in my spirit to talk about some self-care and soul care, being able to rest in God. And so, we took that break, and then the last 2 weeks, obviously, just not being in the hotel, just through that. But the more I thought about just being generous at this Advent season, that is equally fitting to continue on in the theme. One of the things that I've been wanting, that I have been pressing in with you, but I really do want to make sure this it's as clear as I can possibly make it, that money is significantly spiritual. It's not that we're spiritual beings and then we've got this thing over here, which is a kind of necessity, and we get through that as children of God, as disciples. We are, the whole subject of money and finances comes under our life choices, and how we use our money can be an amazing reflection of how much we love those around us who have less. And so I just want to continue on that theme, and just to think about, for all of us, how do we use our money, and how important is money to us? And I want money to be important. I'm not saying that we make it less significant in our lives, but just having God's perspective and God's rule on our finances is an important part of our walk as disciples of Him. Money just we get, as we get older, and we take responsibilities like mortgages and cars and jobs. Money becomes an important aspect of how our lives are governed, and understand that. And if you have children, then we're thinking about their future as well. So all of those things are incredibly important as we think about how we use our money. Even as a single person, I had to learn how to process, or how to use money in such a way that was glorifying to Jesus and usefulness for the kingdom of God. And money has so many benefits. We as a church need money. There's no point in being embarrassed about that statement. In order to have the resources that we have, and in order for us to build up the ministries as we go forward, that takes time and resources. And sometimes we have to invest in that. So money is an important aspect, and God talks about money all the way through the Bible in terms of materialism and finances, giving to God, looking after each other, helping the poor, supporting missions, being sensible in how we manage our finances as well. So these are really, really important aspects. And I've got just some thoughts there about just keeping perspective on money, of what money can do and what money can't do. And so it's important that our hold on money is Paul. It's the love of money. It's if we put that above God, and our pursuit of money becomes a religious thing beyond the management of God's counsel, that's when we start. That's when things start to go wrong in our Christian progress. Isaiah 32:8, and this emphasis really only comes out in the New King James Version, and I wish it had been drawn out in some of the other more modern versions. But a generous man devises generous things, and by generosity they shall stand. So it's a wonderful thought that generosity defines who we are as individuals. And I've said that from the beginning. I keep asking the question, not just to you, but myself, why does God want us to be generous? Well, fundamentally, the reason He wants us to be generous is because He's generous, and He wants us to become like Him. So He's asking us to become generous so that we can be a true reflection of who He is. And also, it breaks the mold of miserliness and hoarding and materialism, and there's so many things that surround the need and issues of greed and possessiveness. And when we begin to manage our money under God's counsel and directive, then those things begin to have less of a grip on our lives, and that's important for us. I've been thinking about, are there any benefits in being generous? I know as Christians we might laugh at the question, and it's almost rhetorical, but I think it's important that we remind ourselves why it's good to be generous. And it's not about having lots or having little. It's about using what we have to honor God in big or small amounts, depending on how He has blessed us. I believe that being generous liberates us from the freedom of financial slavery. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And it's easy for us to use that in order to counsel the unbelievers. But the scriptures are actually written for those of us who are walking in the counsel of God. And it's easy even for us as believers for money to wrap its cords around our life's choices. So Jesus is speaking to his followers. He's speaking to those people who he wanted to go on a Christian journey, and he's saying, you can't have two masters. You can't serve God and money at the same time. Greed may be at the top of my list in terms of God wanting to unshackle us from the chains of possessiveness. But there's other things that are released when we become a people who are generous. Things like debt and poverty. Because when we learn to give, we're releasing other individuals out of that stream. Christians Against Poverty has released millions and millions of pounds, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people out of poverty. Many other good Christian organisations have done the same. Most of what I would call the reform for people's lifestyles over the last 500 years has come from people who had a faith. Issues like stinginess and discontentment, because discontentment is an odd thing, because most of us have an element of discontentment, and I'm okay with that to a certain point, because it should drive us closer into the heart of God. But when we're discontent with what we have or what we don't have, then that's a good mirror to look into. And so being generous liberates us from financial slavery, with all of those emotional ties that would bind us to have more, and for people to suffer as a consequence of the haves and the have-nots. Then I'm thinking about the peace that comes from just learning to trust God. I'm not saying that we throw our every last piece of money into the church coffers. Although there is one example in the New Testament that reminds us of the goodness of God, of the widow who gave her last 2 mites. But with the sensibilities that we have in terms of modern demands upon our finances, we also have to carry those financial responsibilities. But still, we cannot bypass the important truth that Jesus is teaching us through the widow's mite. Is it still good to give? The Philippians gave out of their poverty, and Paul was thanking them for that. And these are tensions I have in my own life of how much we have to use our finances for the care of our own family and those outside of our immediate circle. when I have those particular verses, it's tugging at my sleeves. But what the Bible does tell me is that the more I learn to trust God, the more I'm able to encounter his peace. Because God is no man's debtor. God is incredibly faithful in looking after those who have been faithful in this particular area. Jesus says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give it as the world gives. Do not let your heart be troubled. Do not be afraid. I don't want to stretch that too much. But often we do trouble over money. And often we fret about what the future might look like. If such and such were thing to happen. Or if things were to change direction. But Jesus is saying, don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in the Lord, as King Solomon says, with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. And the reason, and though they're not necessarily tied to financial conditions, you can understand that there's an element of being able just to trust God in every single part of our lives. And the Bible says that when we do that, when we hand over our trust to him, then the peace of God surrounds us and carries us and enables us to live righteously before him. And of course, the joy that just comes in being able to bless someone else. Whether it's stopping at somebody that's sitting in the street, you stop and buy them a sandwich or make a meal for a neighbour. Or you just give that little extra blessing to an individual, financial, or even an increment to the church. It's okay. But just learning to just let go and to be a blessing to your church family and to your community. Paul reminds us. It's one of those things that we don't actually have the verse in the gospel. But he says, in everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work we must help the weak, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus himself, it is more blessed to give than to receive. So we understand that would have been part of Jesus' public teaching, but did not work its way into the Gospels themselves. But Paul is reminding us that is a principle that Jesus has handed down to us. It is more blessed to give than it is to receive. And then just being thankful. And this is a difficult one, because I was pondering this yesterday, and I thought, and I almost apologize for this, but I don't actually have a biblical connection to this. I merely bring to you my own heart and testimony and experience. But somehow learning to give away makes me more thankful. It's the oddest thing. It just makes me more grateful for what I have and what I can do, and the position that God has blessed me in to be a blessing to others. And just learning to be grateful has to seep its way into actions, not just words. Just thankful that we can. Do not be anxious in anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, and with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. I've said that many people are good at thanks speaking and thanks singing, but not perhaps so strong on thanksgiving. But just as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in your love for us, see also that you excel in the grace of giving. So there becomes almost the silver bullet that Paul, in Paul's really short thesis in these 3 chapters to teach the Corinthians that they need to learn to become, not just excel in spiritual gifts, but also in every aspect of their lives, including this particular one. Tozer says, the possessive clinging to things must be torn from our souls with the same determination that Christ expelled the money changers from the temple. As long as we think we own anything, that thing owns us. As soon as we know that we own nothing, then God owns us. Just learning to have a balanced view of life. One of the things that really had been asked of me since arriving in York, and I think even in my interview, was that we would love to have our own building. I'm sure Graham has asked the same request many a time. And you know our journey over the last few weeks and 2 years actually. And you know, York is such a prosperous city that impacts where we can eventually get. Tim and I have had a number of conversations. What we need to do is just to have a strong financial base. I know God has blessed the church, but we really want to focus on how we can save towards having our own building. That is our heart, and we need your help in that. We do. And so we're just how we manage our finances is very important, and every sensible church would do exactly the same. But I would love us to have our own building. And that just means having a substantial deposit to be able to do that. Not even the last place we were looking at renting, and that may still have to continue. And thankfully, we've got a building that we can rent out. But it'd be amazing if we have our own building that we call our own. It would just, who knows what's around the corner. But we do need your support on that as well. I said a few weeks ago that the reason we have somewhere to worship is because faithful people in the past gave sacrificially. We need to follow their example and ask you for the same legacy for the next generation that we have. We all need to share in our corporate responsibility. We cannot just expect others to pay for the services that we all benefit from. This is not something I've touched upon up until now. But giving is worship. Giving is we love singing our songs and telling Jesus how magnificent he is, and rightly so. But giving out of what we have is a demonstration of how grateful we are on a practical level. Again, not wanting to take any verse out of context. So it is with you, since you're eager to have spiritual gifts, excel in those gifts that build up the church. I know, I've been preaching on Corinthians, that those are the spiritual gifts that Paul is releasing the church into. And he's already mentioned 9 gifts specifically, not mentioning money. But in his next epistle, in 2 Corinthians, he does explain that being able to give is a gift. When we give to something or someone, we are gifting them a gift, albeit financial. And if that gift builds up the body, the church, then it's appropriate at least for us to be able to apply it in part to where we're going in our future. We need to understand that giving is an expression of faith in God. It's part of the Old Testament covenant. I missed a point out, and I'll just go back to it only because it wasn't in my notes, but I literally had been mulling on this when I got up this morning. I forgot to add up so much. Remember the areas of blessing that comes from giving, peace and joy and trust. But there was another aspect of it I had thought about that I forgot to add to my notes. And it's really about community and connection. Over the last few years, our world has become very isolated. And I think one of the ladies here was talking to Deborah, and they used the term that we've all built our little Jericho walls around ourselves. I think that's a great phrase. That's an amazing phrase. We've done that for health. We've done that just because of social connections. But we've all built our little Jerichos. And as we begin to give outside of those walls, then we break the walls of isolation. It's good to look after ourselves, our health. Of course it is. It's good to be sensible. But a lot of spiritual things took place in the last 2 years in terms of connection and disconnection, in terms of community and isolation, individualism. And by being able to spend back into the community around us, we break those little Jericho walls. We remind ourselves that we are part of something bigger when we learn to give. And so I close with this slide that we've seen on a number of times. You give to God what is right or what is left. Such an important part of our walk with Jesus. Because being a disciple affects every single part, and money plays a big part. So does our time, so does our attitude, so does our positivity, so does our politeness, so does our love and our conversation and our speech, as Paul has pointed out in Corinthians. But can I just ask you, and as part of our walk with Jesus, to keep on thinking about how we continue to be a generous people, and how we can be a blessing to our community and to our church at the same time. Think about your giving and do that thoughtfully and carefully. So important. As we move further into Advent, we will look at the greatest act of kindness that the world has ever seen. The greatest, most single, generous act. And God is wanting us to walk in the Father's shoes.